Welcome to our character turnaround tutorial. Hopefully there'll be a few tricks you'll pick up from this. We're going to ink, colour and shade our own Forgotten Soldier character for this, but first we'll take a different cowboy character to quickly run through putting the turnaround sketches for this together, as it's a little simpler. We've created this tutorial using our Voodoo Concept Art pack for Procreate, Photoshop, Affinity Designer and Photo, but you can follow along the steps as the principles are pretty universal. That said, one of our bonus goodies from the pack has saved us a massive amount of time here. We're using a few of the body pose brush stamps to give a jumpstart and general framework and pose for a character, but you can draw everything from scratch if you like. We'll start by picking 3 of our male pose stamps to show our character from different angles and pop them onto the page. We recommend picking a bright colour for these or dropping their opacity down so that you can clearly see your own sketch on top. In theory, you can draw as many rotations as you like, but usually 3 or 4 will be enough to give a solid impression of the character. We'll place all 3 on the same layer to keep things neat. Make sure the size of each matches up. For now, we know all these poses will match up perfectly as we're using our own stamps, so we're just making sure the top of the head and feet are matching. However, if you're using other reference images or even drawing everything from scratch, you'll want to draw in or drag in guidelines to make sure everything matches up. You'll see what I'm talking about when we add the second and third rotations of the character. Typically, we'll start by sketching out our first main character rotation. This could even be a T or A pose, whichever works best for you. Just make sure that everything is working for you in the first sketch, as everything will be transferred to the other rotations. For our cowboy, we don't feel like we need to push any of the body features, so we're happy to work with our default physique. We're just marking out our main lines and getting everything in place before tightening up a little more detail. Once we're happy with our rough sketch, we move on to the other 2 or more if we want. This is where our guidelines will come into play. Starting at the top, we'll start to recreate our character, beginning with drawing our hat, then face and so on. The guidelines are super useful. It helps us keep our features at the same size at the same levels where it's relevant. A lot of the elements will just be a case of rotating features slightly and changing the angles. We actually have a load of head rotation stamps in our Voodoo set which can really help with the head part of this. But keep an eye out for some things that are obscured from view from certain angles. The cowboy's gun is a good example of this. You can only see the barrel and the stock of the gun from the front, but you'll need the whole thing from the side or the back. These can be some of the trickier elements and may require a little toing and froing to get working right, but again, the guidelines you've made will help you a lot here. With our basic sketch working pretty well, it's just a case of going over and refining more details and cleaning everything up. Make sure to solve as many problems at this stage before we move on to the ink and colour phases, as it will save you a lot of hassle in the long run. On our cowboy, we're just adding a really quick light grey colour swipe to give us a better look at his silhouette and form. It's not a mandatory step, but it can help you see things a little clearer before you finalise all of your sketch lines. Let's switch over to a sketch we've already cleaned up and have ready to go for a new character, the Forgotten Soldier. We're going to ink the outlines for each of the turnaround characters on the same layer. This is the general approach we will take for rendering all 4 versions simultaneously. It's especially useful for colour or effects layers. You can tweak them across all 4 at the same time without having to go diving through layers and folders and make adjustments individually. The inking is one of the most important steps, so make sure to take your time. Don't be afraid of the undo button and redraw any strokes you're not happy with or that are a little bit too messy. And make a few practice strokes before you even start to make sure you're happy with your brush choice and thickness of the stroke. Check that it will work on important lines as well as the finer details. In theory, you should have solved any problems at the sketch cleanup stage. Inking can be one of the most relaxing things you can do if all you need to do is focus on each stroke you make with some nice music in the background. You can have a lot of varied stroke thickness if you like, but for our Forgotten Soldier, we're going to keep the strokes mostly uniform with only a little bit of variation in them. As always, make sure to rotate your canvas so your wrist or arm motions are as comfy to make as possible. This will massively help your consistency of strokes as well. Next, we'll colour in our flat base colours. In the same way that having your sketch correct before inking makes things a breeze, having your ink lines drawn right makes this step super easy. You're just colouring in the areas inside the lines you've just drawn. Check out our tips video link below for a few ways to fill in areas in all of the main drawing apps. Simply create a separate layer for each colour you're going to use. Don't get too hung up on having the perfect colours just yet, as we'll definitely be tweaking these soon. For a little tidy up, we'll drop our ink line opacity so we can clearly see our colours and make sure they're right, and we'll manually draw and erase parts to get them perfect. We'll use the same technique to block out the bandages colour, then the rest of the clothes, with each colour having its own layer. Our next step is to create a masked group folder which we'll use for our shadow and effects layers. This is a must-know trick as to make sure that anything that we put in here stays inside the overall silhouette shape. The process for creating this is slightly different in the various illustration apps like Procreate or Affinity Designer or Photo, so check out the tips video below to see how to do these in those apps. For now we're using Photoshop, so we're going to hold Command or Control plus Shift, click on each of the layer thumbnails we want to include in the silhouette mask and add them to the selection. With everything selected, create a folder and click on the Create Mask icon and you'll see the mask get added to the folder. Now any layers we place in the folder will stay inside our character's silhouette. We're now going to add our main overall shadow layer on top of everything. The trickiest part is figuring out where to put your shadows, and for this we can't recommend enough looking at or using lighting reference images to help you out. We're using a single colour for everything with a multiply layer blend mode and an opaque brush to create mostly hard shadows here. I recommend not using black for shadows. Having a touch of colour in there makes them much more interesting, so usually having a little blue or purple in there works wonders, especially when using the multiply blend mode. The key thing is to pick a direction for your light source from the start and stick to it throughout the illustration so it's consistent in each piece. There's no point in having the left side of the face in shadow if the left side of the body is all in light. The shadows perform two functions really. One is to simply show where the lighting is to make the illustration more interesting, and the other is to expand on this and create form and three-dimensional shapes on your illustration. You can get incredibly complex with using different types of hard and soft shadows to achieve this, but for this particular turnaround style, we want to keep it simple, particularly because it's quicker to do, but mainly because it gives a specific look to the pieces. We're leaning towards looking a little bit like a comic style illustration or perhaps even cell shading, so we basically want to use them just enough to show form in a simplistic way. We just work our way around each of the character rotations, building up the shadows as we go. This is a very quick but effective step. It's drawing a little from comic art where often important shadows are rendered completely in black. We're using it sparingly here though. It's very easy to get carried away and add a lot of drama to any piece with these hard shadows. But we want to be reserved for this illustration as we only want to add a little bit of depth without becoming a key part of the style. We weren't 100% happy with the bandage, so we're just going to fix it a little. Don't ever be afraid to go back and fix something if it's wrong. This is the beauty of working with digital art. Take advantage of working in layers and the undo key. We're just going to make sure that the bandage wraps around the face nicely. We'll erase, redraw the bandage outlines, and because our layers are neat, we can easily draw in the bandage colour and the shadow on their respective layers. We've popped in a solid colour onto the background to give us just a little bit of contrast before we add some highlights to the piece, but using a neutral colour is usually a good way to go. Obviously you can go crazy with the background colours if you like, depending on what you want to create yourself. For this, we just want a background to stay in the background and not be part of the overall aesthetic. This step is almost the inverse of the shadow step. Again, on a new layer, we're going to add in light highlights, typically on the opposite side of each part of our character to the shadows. This is the step that usually really starts to bring artwork to life. For this, we didn't want to just go for a plain white colour, so we're using a pale blue with a hard light layer blend mode. We're using this almost like a rim light. It's not everything throughout the piece, just like the hard dark shadows we used earlier, so we just do them sparingly. It's just a few dabs near the edges to give it a little bit more vibrancy. While we're down at his feet, we're going to quickly add some underfoot shadows. This isn't totally necessary, but it does help ground the illustration a little bit. We're not aiming for much accuracy here, just an abstract shape used with a multiply blend mode and the opacity dropped right down so it's quite subtle. Lastly, we're going to just do another pass on the light layer to make the highlights just a little bit chunkier and bolder as it will match the character a little bit better. As anybody who's ever seen any of our videos knows, we love a nice texture or noise layer to help everything look a little bit less digital and perfect, while helping the colours to gel together even better. In our group folder, we're going to create a new layer and fill it with white, then go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. We usually use 20% noise with uniform distribution with monochromatic checked on. Then we set the layer blend mode to linear burn and we can drop the opacity to taste. We don't want the effect to be too in your face here, as it can darken and muffle your colours a little bit. We want just enough so it's having a subtle effect. From this point, you could really go to town on it and add more detail and use more rendering tricks to really make them look polished and shiny. Check out our other videos if you'd like to do that. But for what we wanted this guy for, we're going to call him done.